The words echoed through the room with a sharp finality. "You depend on me now." Her tone was calm, but it carried a weight that made everyone else fall silent. It wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration. The kind that left no space for disagreement. The kind that expected obedience without question. The young man standing across from her didn't respond immediately. His posture remained steady, but his silence spoke louder than words. To anyone watching, it looked like he had accepted his place in that moment. Like he understood exactly who held the power in the room. That assumption was exactly what she believed. The millionaire's wife stood confidently, her presence dominating the space. Everything about her, from the way she held herself to the way she spoke, reflected control. She was used to being listened to, used to being the final voice in any conversation. Around her, the room felt carefully arranged, not just in design, but in hierarchy. Everyone knew where they stood. Near the edge of the room, barely noticed, stood the old maid. She held a tray with practiced stillness, her eyes lowered just enough to avoid attention. Most people, she was part of the background, someone who moved quietly between moments, never interrupting, never influencing. Years of working in that house had made her presence almost invisible, and she had allowed that invisibility to become her shield. But she heard everything, every word, every tone, every shift in the room. Her expression didn't change as the conversation unfolded. She didn't react when the woman stepped closer, reinforcing her dominance. She didn't look up when the silence grew heavier, but inside, something had already begun to move. Because she recognized something others didn't. This wasn't just a conversation about control. It was a moment built on assumption. The young man finally lifted his gaze, meeting the woman's eyes for just a second. There was no anger there, no fear either. Just a quiet awareness. He looked away again, as if choosing not to challenge the moment. That choice only strengthened her confidence. She turned slightly, satisfied, believing the situation was settled, and that's when the maid moved. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. She stepped back, placing the tray gently on a nearby table. No one looked at her. No one questioned it. Why would they? Had done this 1,000 times before, but this time was different. Her hand slipped into her pocket, pulling out her phone with a calm precision. Posture remained the same, her presence unchanged. Yet when she raised the phone to her ear, something shifted. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but no longer invisible. Her voice didn't rise, but it changed. Softness remained, yet there was a clarity beneath it, something structured and deliberate. She spoke only a few words, calm and precise, as if every second mattered. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Whatever she said on that call was understood immediately on the other end. Around her, the room carried on as if nothing had happened. The millionaire's wife turned back toward the young man, her confidence fully restored. To her, the moment had already been decided. She moved slowly, almost gracefully, reinforcing her position with every step. Her words resumed, quieter now but sharper, as if she was sealing the outcome she believed she had secured. The young man listened, his expression neutral. Didn't interrupt, didn't challenge her. Something in his posture had shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't visible to everyone, but it was there. Stillness that didn't belong to defeat, but to patience. The maid ended her call and lowered the phone. For a brief second, her eyes lifted, not toward the center of the room, but toward the far wall, as if she was measuring time rather than watching people. Just as quietly, she returned the phone to her pocket. No one noticed, or rather, no one thought there was anything to notice. She stepped back to where she had been, her hands resting calmly in front of her. Her expression returned to its familiar stillness, the same one she had worn for years. Same one that made people overlook her without a second thought. Minutes passed, the conversation in the room began to settle, tension easing slightly as the millionaire's wife assumed everything was under control. A faint sense of resolution filled the space, as though the outcome had already been written. Then, a phone vibrated. It was subtle at first, just a quiet interruption. The millionaire's wife glanced down at her device, her expression unchanged as she checked the screen, but as her eyes moved across the message, something shifted. Her posture tightened. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to break the rhythm of the room. She looked at the screen again, as if confirming what she had just read. The confidence that had filled her voice moments earlier didn't disappear, but it wavered. Across from her, the young man noticed. He didn't react, but his attention sharpened. The maid remained still, her gaze lowered once more, her presence unchanged. There was a quiet awareness in the way she stood, as if she already knew what was coming next, because whatever had begun with that call was no longer invisible. The message on her phone didn't go away. If anything, it seemed to grow heavier with every second she stared at it. Her expression, once steady and assured, began to tighten in a way she couldn't fully control. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was uncertainty. And that alone was enough to change the energy in the room. She tried to recover quickly, lifting her gaze as if nothing had happened. But the rhythm of her confidence had been interrupted. The words she spoke next didn't carry the same weight. They sounded slightly delayed, slightly forced, as though her mind was now divided between the conversation and whatever she had just seen. Across from her, the young man noticed the shift clearly. This time, he didn't look away. He held his position, his silence no longer passive. There was a quiet focus in his eyes now, as if he was waiting, not for her words, but for something else entirely. Then another phone vibrated. This time, it wasn't hers. A man standing near the back of the room glanced down at his device, his brows pulling together as he read. He looked up briefly, then back at the screen again. The change in his expression didn't go unnoticed. Within seconds, a second person checked their phone. Then a third. The room, once centered around a single voice, began to fracture into smaller moments of confusion. The millionaire's wife saw it happening, even if she didn't fully understand why. Her gaze moved from one person to another, catching the subtle reactions, the exchanged looks, the unspoken questions forming in the air. The bowl was no longer sitting firmly in her hands. It was slipping, quietly, without explanation. "What is it?" she asked, her voice sharper now. No one answered immediately. Instead, one of the men stepped forward slightly, holding his phone with a hesitation that suggested he wasn't sure how to say what needed to be said. The silence stretched just long enough to make the moment heavier. Then he spoke, carefully. The information was brief, but its impact was immediate. Something had changed. Not in the room itself, but beyond it. Something tied to ownership, to authority, to decisions that had already been set in motion. And somehow, all of it connected back to a single action, one that had gone unnoticed just minutes earlier. Her grip on her phone tightened. She looked around again, searching for control, for clarity, for something that still belonged to her. But the room no longer responded the way it had before. The balance had shifted. Near the doorway, the maid remained exactly where she had been, quiet. Still, moved, but this time, when her eyes lifted slightly, there was no need to hide what had already been set into motion. The silence that followed felt different from before. It was no longer controlled, no longer shaped by one person's voice. It carried uncertainty now, spreading through the room in quiet waves. Glance, every small movement, reflected the same question: what just changed? The millionaire's wife stood still, her phone still in her hand, but her confidence no longer anchored her the way it had moments ago. She tried to speak again, to regain the rhythm she once controlled, but the room didn't respond the same way. Attention had shifted, and she could feel it. "What's going on?" she asked again, this time more direct. The men who had stepped forward earlier hesitated, then finally spoke with clarity. The information was undeniable. Ownership structures had been altered. Authority had been reassigned. Decisions had already been executed, not discussed. And the timing made it impossible to ignore what had triggered it. Her expression changed completely now. Not just uncertainty, but realization. Slowly, almost instinctively, her gaze moved across the room, and stopped at the doorway. For the first time, she truly saw the maid, not as part of the background, not as someone passing through unnoticed, but as someone connected to everything that had just unfolded. The stillness, the calm presence, the quiet confidence that had never needed attention, it all made sense in a single, undeniable moment. The room followed her gaze. Silence deepened. The maid didn't move. She didn't step forward, didn't raise her voice, didn't attempt to explain. She simply stood there, composed, her hands resting calmly as they always had. The difference now was clear. She was no longer invisible. The millionaire's wife took a slow step forward, her certainty gone, replaced by something far more fragile. "You," she began, but the words didn't fully form. The maid allowed a small, calm smile to appear. Not out of pride, not out of victory, but out of understanding. She had seen this moment coming long before anyone else had realized it was possible. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, clear, and unmistakably confident. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, because the room was already listening. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had just changed. Not an explanation, not an argument, just truth. The kind that doesn't ask for permission to be heard. No one interrupted. No one challenged her, because in that moment, it was no longer about what she said. It was about what she had already done. The balance of power had shifted completely, and as the realization settled across every face in the room, one thing became impossible to ignore: the person they had overlooked the most was the one who had been in control all along.